Good morning. Today we're going to continue on with our lesson on our guided notes. This is going to be in your interactive notebook. Interactive notebook, page 45. You're going to have your guided notes, page 46. You're going to have your summary of 2 things that you learned in today's lesson. 2 things that you learned in today's lesson with 4 to 5 complete sentences. Please do not list the things that you learned. I want to see you write. So a summary is 4 to 5 sentences, 2 things that you learned in today's lesson. We're going to be starting with classification of living things. You all should have your handouts. Those of you at home, you will need to print it. If you do not have access to a printer, then you'll have to wait for you to get a copy when you return. Sorry about that. Scientists have described and named a total of 1.5 million species. It is estimated that the total number of species is about 10 million. You guys can understand why we would need some kind of classification just based on the number of species that we have alone, so that we can classify them into their respective families so that we can keep track of them. Obviously, if they have evolved and many have gone extinct, then that would be a real importance that scientists study those organisms that were once living that are no longer with us, but the new organisms that have evolved from those. Life on Earth is constantly evolving and changing slowly over time. Biological classification is how biologists group organisms rooted in works by Aristotle. Scientists attempt to order the natural world by grouping and classifying all living organisms. As technologies improve, so have our systems of classification. A summary of Darwin's theory of evolution states that organisms produce more offspring than can survive. Of the offspring that do survive, many will never reproduce. So remember last week when I told you it's not just about survival of the fittest and being able to survive, but you've also got to be able to reproduce and pass on those good genes to your offspring. If you cannot reproduce, then that's not really what we're talking about when we're talking about survival of the fittest, okay? Because more organisms are produced than can survive, there is intense competition for limited resources such as food, water, shelter, and I even went so far last week as to even mention space. Remember the analogy I gave you about Thanksgiving and everybody sitting around the house, you, mom, and your siblings, and you got 2 siblings, and you have 1 hen for Thanksgiving, and the trimmings enough for your little family. But then your extended family, your aunt and your uncle and their 2 kids, they fall on hard times and something happens that makes them have to come and live with you for a little short period of time. But immediately you start to compete for what? Mom's going to tell you can't have another piece of hen because why? It's got to make it stretch for everybody to have enough, right? Or just enough. Food, shelter, water, space. And we're talking about shelter. You got a little 2-bedroom apartment and you've got you and dad and your 2 siblings, and then you've got aunt and uncle and their 2 kids. So it starts to get a little cramped. Tempers start to get a little heated because mom says you can't take a shower when you normally want to. And then you might have to sleep on the floor and give your bed to your cousins. You just never know. But we also, as a species, we experience some of these things in our own world, but we may not even realize it. Food, shelter, water, space. When any of those things are limited, we're going to be in competition with others for those things, or we're going to have to migrate elsewhere to find those things. And if we can't find those things that we need in order to survive, then we may eventually die off, right? That's the analogy I used last week, and hopefully you were in class. If you weren't, that's what I'm talking about. Sometimes we get temperamental when we start having to compete. We might have some fighting going on. Sometimes when those things like water or just the luxury of being able to take a shower and cleanliness. Sometimes we know, and I'm talking about in our own species, sometimes we know that if we are struggling for any of those things, we could very much have a different life. Because what did we say? Anytime you don't get enough to eat, anytime you can't keep your body clean, anytime your surroundings are not very clean, then you can end up with infections start to set in, right? Disease starts to set in. And that's a lot of times how some of these species are killed off or they die, is because disease sets in. Whenever you start staying up too late, you don't get enough sleep, you don't get enough rest, you don't get enough food, you start to get sick, right? Your body's immune system can't fight off those things as easily. Individuals that are best suited to their environment survive. They reproduce and they pass their traits on to their offspring. Other organisms that are less suited for their environment often die or will be reproductively competitive. This is the process of natural selection and causes the many species of organisms on Earth to change over time. The species that are alive on Earth today are descended with modification from ancestral species that lived in the past. And I'll give you just a minute to see if you have missed getting some of your notes. I've only got 15 minutes of time on these videos, guys, so I may have to do 2. For 3.5 billion years, life on Earth has constantly been changing. Natural selection has led to staggering diversity in organisms. Diversity, we said, with differences, right? Lots of differences, and that's a good thing, because remember I said if all of us had a certain gene that was no good, such as the BRCA gene that causes breast cancer, then we would reproduce and we would pass that on to all of our offspring, and then eventually what would happen? You got it. To study this diversity, scientists must give each organism a name and sort them into groups. So that's what we call taxonomy. To study the diversity of life, biologists use a classification system to name organisms and group them in a logical manner. We call this taxonomy. That's the branch of biology that classifies organisms and assigns each organism a universally accepted name. Benefits of classifying: to accurately and uniformly name organisms. Uniformly means what? We all do it in one. See that prefix uni? Like a unicycle, one-wheeled bicycle, right? Uni means one way. We do it in one way. So across the board, all scientists are doing it the same way. Prevents misnomers, such as starfish and jellyfish that aren't really fish at all. Uses same language, Latin or some Greek, for all names. Seahorse. Confusion in using different languages for names. Un mofit in singulier. Skunk. They all mean the same thing? No. Latin names are understood by all taxonomists. So all taxonomists know that Mephitis is a skunk. Carolus Linnaeus, 18th century taxonomist, that's who he was. He classified organisms by their structure, developed a naming system still used today. Called the father of taxonomy, that's who he is. Who is the father of evolution? You got it, Darwin. He developed a modern system of naming known as binomial nomenclature. Prefix bi means two names nomenclature, a two-word name, genus and species. For example, humans are Homo, that's the genus, sapiens, that's the species. Hierarchy taxonomic groups. There's a domain, a kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Yes, you do need to know these. And see, we normally, well, we'll talk about that later. I won't do that to you right now. This is the broadest taxon. That means this is very broad, includes much more organisms than what is specific to our species here. You can take a look at this one and see how it is grouped. So this is broad. It has a whole bunch of different animals in it, and then it gets a little bit less, like we took out the ocean ones, right, because this is a starfish, and now you've got these organisms, and then you've got your class of mammals, and then you got your carnivores, which are meat eaters, right? Then you got your families, so all our bears are lumped into a family. Then we got our genus, where we have got to tell, okay, whether it's looks like a polar bear, whether it's a grizzly bear, and those are separated in our genus. Then we've got our specific species. So one way or mnemonic that you can memorize this is dumb King Philip came over for good soup. That is the order. Yes, you do need to know the order. That's why I'm giving it to you. Dumb King Philip came over for good soup. The most specific is at the bottom, and then it branches up. So look at this as an upside down triangle with the top being at the bottom. Okay, but that's the more specific one. Eukarya, that is cells with nuclei. And guys, this is 7th grade science, so if you don't remember this, please make sure that you know prokaryotic cells are those that do not have a nucleus. Okay, do not have a nucleus. Eukaryotic, as this sounds, right? Eukarya. They are cells with nucleus. And what is important about the nucleus? That is where the DNA is held in most cells, except for bacteria. The DNA in bacteria cells is just within the cell itself. There is no nuclei that is holding the DNA. Okay. This is just showing your classification level of different species. I'm not going to go over every single one of these, but we talked about primate last week. We talked about Homo sapiens. We know that we are mammals, mammalia, so we've talked about that. Chordata, that is having a spinal cord. Animalia, that sounds like what? Animals, right? So here again is your classification level, and then you can see what all is different classes, different phylums. I'll let you guys take a look at it. You can stop this video at any time to get your notes if I'm going too fast. Common ancestors. A common ancestor is a previous species that new species evolved from. Evolutionary theory suggests that monkeys and humans have a common ancestor. Misconception that humans evolved from monkeys. This is not true. And I said this last week, but I'm reiterating here. What is true? Humans and monkeys have a common ancestor. And I'm not going to go into all this. You can stop the video and you can read it. I'm not going to read it to you because remember I said I'm not going into that human versus monkey evolution stuff. That is not what I'm here for. Okay? Evolutionary tree, common ancestors 6 million years ago. Why do scientists use a tree versus something else? Where the branches meet, the trunk shows a common ancestor. So where the branches meet, like seaweed and land plants, there is a common ancestor somewhere here prior to the evolution. So monkeys and humans, you see, is here. Somewhere there must have been a common ancestor, and that's all I'm saying. Science, and remember I talked about this last week, not crossing that line between science and religion. That's a personal home matter, not doing it. Monkeys and humans, land plants and seaweed. Evolution is not changes in population size. Evolution is not individual organisms growing and growing through metamorphosis or changes, such as a tadpole changing into a frog. It is not. Evolution is not individual organisms evolving during their lifetime. This is not possible. Remember, we talked about that brown bear on that white background in the Arctic. We know that it can't miraculously just change its fur into a white fur so that it can blend better into the background.